I think there is definitely a shift. I'm hearing in the academic environment or in academic spaces that some professors, faculty, also students are getting concerned about how they show up in public spaces. What do they say publicly, on Twitter, X, on podcasts? And what do they write about publicly? But even what they're researching, I've been hearing comments like, oh, is this going to be too sensitive? Is a topic to talk about this or that?
It can't happen here in the United States, you may think, but it's already happening. This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied periods of great change when authoritarian rulers began to establish or abuse their power, or when old orders fell apart. I'm your host, Jeremy Goldkorn, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. Maria Repnikova, I am delighted to welcome to the podcast today. She's a scholar of China's political communication. She speaks Mandarin, Russian, and Spanish. Like my paternal grandparents, Maria is originally from Latvia. She's an associate professor in global communication at Georgia State University. She received a doctorate in politics at the University of Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. She's the author of the books Chinese Soft Power and Media Politics in China, Improvising Power Under Authoritarianism, as well as many articles and papers on related topics. Recently, she has been studying Chinese soft power in Africa. Now, here we are in the United States, where the Trump and Musk administration are pressuring and squeezing universities, law firms, and the media. And American news organizations, not all but many, are bending the knee one by one to our new authoritarian government. I want to ask Maria what we can learn from China and Russia when it comes to the mechanisms by which authoritarian regimes control and manipulate the news, and how critical journalism can survive in a newly hostile environment, and much more. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Maria.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to be speaking to you again, and a slightly different subject in a way from what I've previously interviewed you about, which is focused on China. Let's start with something we were talking about just before we started recording, something that you've been teaching about, which is coping mechanisms. How does one cope in a situation like we face today in the United States, where the political realities that you read about in the news can be so absolutely depressing, but they have not perhaps yet actually made any significant changes to one's personal life? What do you do about this situation?
Yeah, it's a very challenging reality that I think we're all facing. Many of us are facing. And of course, some of us are already experiencing the changes, right? Depending on which institution we're working at, or which city we live in, or which community we're part of, we might already be directly impacted by the new policy changes in the political environment. But I think about my own case, where it feels like my personal survival or existence is still quite distinct from the political environment. Like I'm still teaching my courses and living in a nice city and basically continuing my life. But as soon as I open the news and read what's happening, it feels extremely depressing and debilitating. So one of the things that I've been teaching about in my course on authoritarianism and global age is different modalities of resistance. And one of them is actually kind of the banal resistance, which is everyday survival or everyday meaning making in an authoritarian system. And in this course, we don't really talk as much about the U.S. They're much more severe authoritarian cases. We talk about Rwanda, for instance, pre-genocide. We talk about Egypt. We talked about China and other contexts. But the main kind of takeaway from that week, which I taught last week, the last session, was that micro meaning making, like, little rituals of joy, or creating solidarity across different communities, or building and fostering friendships with like-minded people, or finding creative activities, whether it's through art, consuming or creating or writing, or thinking about something outside of politics, is not necessarily kind of a cop-out. It's actually a way of fostering kind of an inner garden, or a space for yourself to grow, to flourish, and to find something that's a little bit softer, like a buffer, to get through this really challenging political reality.
So you shouldn't feel guilty about finding moments of joy in your life, even if the world is burning around us.
So I've been struggling with that idea for a while, because as a fellow Jewish person from Latvia, I feel this like a natural response for me, which I realized, through certain sessions in therapy and readings in psychology, that it's also kind of an easy way out sometimes. It's like easy to feel guilty, right? It's like the natural thing for me to do.
You can wallow in it.
Exactly. You can wallow it, and then you're stuck there and you think, well, what productive path does that really create for you? And not like it's all about productivity, but it just seems to kind of set you back, and then you just feel negative about yourself and about the world. I think that one could see this as creating a certain kind of softness around yourself that allows you to be more fluid. If you think about it, the water metaphor, just more adaptive, and to see this whole political environment as something we're going to be going through as a marathon, as kind of a long-term phenomenon. This is not going to be a short sprint. What's happening now is, it's quite radical. It's fast-paced, but it's not something that's 1 month long, 6 months. It could be, could be 4 years. It could be longer, right? Trump is talking about a third term. All kinds of things are unpredictable and very challenging to just even fully process process because they're just unfolding in front of us.
And this is the nation of instant gratification. So I think it's quite hard for a lot of people to think about things, that there's no easy off switch.
There isn't. Yeah, there's no easy off switch and there's no easy scenario that just sounds good. It's like, okay, next election, we're just going to vote him out. But we're not sure at this point whether that's even feasible or what kind of elections we're going to have or who is the alternative to Trump. I mean, the chaos feels rather like heavy. It's not something that feels like, oh yeah, just a little like the first term. It's like it's just one term. It's an anomaly. Now it feels like the system is just being broken down from within. And recently in DC, a close friend called this like an acid wash effect. It's like everything is being washed out and all the pretenses are gone. And we just see all this raw response from institutions, from individuals, from communities. So I think in this very harsh acid-like environment, right, creating something soft for yourself is actually a productive technique. One shouldn't feel guilty about those joyous moments as long as you can find a balance to stay connected to the realities in a way that maybe you feel like you're contributing to something, or maybe you're involved in a way that feels good to you or feels not too taxing. Like you're not avoiding it altogether, and yet you're still having your buffer, your kind of a sense of self that's protected. Your individuality / community building is still happening alongside the chaos.
Let's turn a little bit to the chaos. I mean, your last book was Chinese Soft Power, and the concept has become so much more interesting in a way in the second Trump administration because the world of soft power has been completely upended since your book came out a century ago. I mean, in 2022. What do you make of our current moment, the apparent destruction by Team Trump and Musk of American soft power, and how China is responding?
Yeah, it's interesting because my book was on China, but see, there always contrast to the U.S. because I see China is very much adapting to the U.S. soft power kind of practices and concepts as part of its own, strategy. So it was inspired. China was inspired by the U.S. in creating this concept and readapting it to its own realities. But now the U.S. is completely, as you said, obliterating it. What I make of it, I mean, it feels like very systematic obliteration. I mean, we see it from different angles. On one hand, major kind of overhaul of big relationships with allies, whether it's Canada, right, or we think about Mexico, European Union, all these different partners who are now extremely upset with the United States and just don't see the U.S. anymore as a reliable partner. Again, this was the case in his first administration, but now it feels harsher, more serious, more profound. And then at the same time, complete destruction of institutions of soft power. I mean, if you think about U.S.A. and just recently, I don't know if you've seen the news about the Wilson Center being destructed or, they're told to shut down. I was a fellow there twice and we were just supposed to have a conference in June. And this fellowship is all about promoting also American kind of not just values, but intellectual community and like interactions with the world. There were fellows from all over the world at the institution. Those kind of places are being shut down. So this is like an institutionalized destruction. And then I've been reading some hearings and reports with some Republican kind of participants and Congress people about diplomacy under Trump. And they are basically arguing that Biden was too much into soft power. Like there was too much soft power going on. So now we need to embrace more like hard power, but also the soft power they're associated with Biden is like the progressive soft power. It's all about certain ideals and projects that are just, not really adhering to the American values. We think about progressive, LGBTQ projects or other gender-related stuff that's now being also attacked. So it's coming from all directions. And I think it's interesting that it's resonating with his base, at least in terms of politicians. I don't know about the public at large, but maybe the public as well, that it's like a waste of money and, we don't really need it. But the effects will be definitely long-term. It's very hard to rebuild this. And how China is responding for now, I've been surprised that it's not been as vocal about, kind of replacing the U.S. or pushing back or pushing out a new version of soft power, and so to speak. But I imagine that it's going to fill the gap the way it has in the first administration, right? To position itself as a more pro-globalization leader in the world, but also as being the most accessible kind of rising power, especially in the global south. If I think about Africa, where I've done my research, China was already seen as a very accessible partner, like when it comes to...
Accessible.
Yeah, accessible. So resources, trainings, education, media, kind of diplomacy and so forth. It wasn't seen as a number one choice. Like the U.S. was still preferred. But if the U.S. becomes almost obsolete, like it's absent, it's not there, China is the only choice. So it's kind of replacing by virtue of just the other choice being absent, right? It doesn't have to do much to replace the U.S. because the U.S. won't be engaged.
They've just got to stand back and enjoy it, really.
Exactly. They can just stand back and kind of be fluid and just adapt to the circumstance. They don't have to be aggressive about it. They can just kind of, like you said, enjoy the shift. So interesting phenomena to observe. So I think China's soft power is not going anywhere, but it's going to have much more leeway and maybe, much less adoption and kind of maybe more positive perceptions elsewhere because of the U.S. absence.
Yeah. The other sort of interesting switchover I found is that wolf warrior diplomacy, which is, usually thought of as something that started, I guess, about midway through Xi's tenure, where diplomats started using very harsh language. I mean, that possibly inspired by Trump's first term, but you started to get these very aggressive statements out of certain diplomats. Some of them even made their careers by being strident commentators on Twitter and in press conferences. And that seems to have ended in China, or at least those such voices have been moderated. A lot of the leading wolf warrior diplomats have been sidelined. But now that seems to be what the US is doing. I mean, J.D. Vance seems to think that every time he speaks to foreigners, he should sort of beat them over the head with some, major insult or threat to invade. What do you make of, how do you think the world is going to respond to this?
Well, I don't think it's responding very well. I mean, it's kind of, like you said, it's a lot of insulting language and just showing off like American prowess in a very harsh way, but also a lot of coercive actions, right? Like coercing other countries to agree to US policies based on threats. So in some ways, ironically, it's like the US is kind of engaging with some of these hard power tactics that China has been engaged with. And there have been whole books written about China's coercive diplomacy, right? Especially in the economic arena, like, threatening a country, to cut off kind of not diplomatic, but trade ties and so forth in response to certain political statements or policies with China. So I was just struck by how that seems kind of similar to what the US is now doing. Is just like operating through threats and saying, if you don't do this, we'll do that. And I remember in the very early speech President Trump made after his election, he was asked a question about diplomacy in Latin America. And I think the journalist was from the region. And he just said it's going to be great because they need us. We don't need them.
Right.
Which was just, it was a very bizarre response, but it's again kind of this notion that we're the more powerful. Like if we think about just in a survival sort of idea, like we're the powerful player here. So you're just going to have to adjust to us. There's no option. So that's why diplomacy will be great, because you will succumb to our terms and conditions because you don't have a choice.
In 2010, I think Yang Jiechi, the Chinese diplomat, was in Southeast Asia, and he made this statement about some countries are big countries and some countries are small countries, and that's just a fact.
Yeah, it makes me think of China as also like big country diplomacy.
Yeah.
The way they prioritize it, no matter what, the big countries get priority. Like they can talk all they want about global south, right? In China and Africa and all those different regions that they care about. But if you look at the diplomatic language of Chinese officials, they always have like layers of importance. And the big ones, the big countries are always the first layer. That's just how the world works, right? So it's, again, some parallels here in a way with the US.
Absolutely seems to be the way Trump thinks. So let's talk about media control in China. Can you describe the system of the Chinese Communist Party and the government, how they control the media and propaganda organizations?
So I'll just try to lay out like a few maybe layers of control or institutions and how this works. So maybe listeners have heard of propaganda department in China, kind of institutions that control the media, central propaganda department, but it's been renamed as publicity department, which is interesting because Chinese term Xuanchuan is directly translated as propaganda, but actually it also has a different meaning of publicity, which is softer. But in reality, this institution manages the entire kind of media apparatus, and it sets the agenda for, what kind of themes, what kind of directions should the media be going into or going towards in their reporting on daily basis. The day-to-day coverage, including kind of censoring content or suggesting to the media what to cover, preemptive directiveness comes from local propaganda departments, they're regional. And they are the ones that have the most kind of prowess over media that are registered in a particular region. So it's like a kind of localized control that is probably most significant when it comes to day-to-day practices of these media outlets. But the Central Propaganda Department in Beijing sets the big kind of macro agenda. And then in addition to that, we have the General Administration for Publication and Press, which is the acronym is GAP, which is in charge of licensing. So basically licensing who gets to be a media outlet, who gets to be a journalist. Journalists have to be licensed. And under Xi Jinping's administration or rule, there's been a lot of new rules and directives about passing certain ideological tests and requirements to get a license as a journalist. So there's kind of a bureaucratic domain of regulation here as well. If you don't pass through tests, if you don't behave a certain way, you can also end up with no license, then you can't really officially report. So that's kind of a different arm, a different way of directing media content. And at the same time, there's also the cyber administration in China that controls the digital content. And that's a really important institution that's in charge of essentially digital kind of media management. But because all media now has a digital component or it's mostly online, there are all kinds of directives that editors are getting. Some of them are from propaganda departments, some of them from the digital side, and they have to be always on and ready to receive those sort of messages and instructions. A few years ago, when I was still talking to editors and journalists in China, I heard that they're working like 24-hour cycles because they're receiving messages on WeChat all the time about what to edit, what to delete, how to adjust their text. So it's kind of like a constant negotiation and constant adjustment of their content that they're pushing out and publicizing. And because it's online, it's easy to get rid of it. So unlike print media in the past, it doesn't just stay there. You can always readjust on what you're publishing. But I think a lot of the actual control happens through self-censorship, which is very relatable, I think, to the US context as well and to many other contexts in the world, is that it's not so much about institutions, but it's the fear of the ambiguous instructions, the large brackets of information that may or may not be legitimate to cover. And as a result, many editors and journalists just kind of succumb to softening their reporting, not reporting on something at all, or fearing the repercussions of their reporting. So as a result, a lot of it is kind of self-control, self-regulation. So I think that that's kind of the main medium, which is, of course, the least costly for the government because they don't have to do anything. People just censor themselves.
And that's the one that I think is already happening in the United States. I mean, just even in my own working life, doing this podcast and some of the other journalistic and editorial work I've been doing, I have now already encountered a handful of people who have declined to contribute writing or to even appear on this podcast because they are in the United States on a visa and they're worried that if they express the wrong point of view in public, they might get into trouble, which I found, truly alarming because one of the things when I came to this country from after 20 years in China, it was so relaxing was it was suddenly, I can say whatever I want and I don't even have to think about it. And that doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
I think there is definitely a shift. I'm hearing in the academic environment or in academic spaces that some professors, faculty, also students are getting concerned about how they show up in public spaces. What do they say publicly, on Twitter, X, on podcasts? What do they write about publicly? But even what they're researching, I've been hearing comments like, is this going to be too sensitive as a topic to talk about this or that? Hearing that somebody else was kind of, quote, softly disciplining another faculty saying, hey, you should be a little more careful about your posts online. So the language that I'm hearing like very much speaks to some kind of spread of this, elusive censoring kind of environment, right?
Yeah.
It's not that somebody in particular is telling you from the top down. Like in China, there are these top down actors and institutions that can tell you like this is not to be published. This is how it should be published. In addition to self-censorship. Self-censorship is maybe like the protective gear people kind of kick into, but there are all these other actors telling you what to do. But in the US, we don't quite have that yet, right? But we do have this sort of vague, stretchy notion of self-censorship that is alarming. I agree that I'm hearing comments very regularly from people.
And I think it's hitting academia first with the attacks on university funding before it hits the media. I mean, that seems to be where the current drive of the administration is targeting universities.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear, maybe we'll get to this later, kind of the different ways in which people cope with that. But some of the coping strategies I've been hearing about, like renaming courses, like, right? If it's a course that has critical race theory in it, let's like rename it into something else. Renaming DI into something else. Reminds me a lot of China, right? Because like in Chinese universities, I remember like certain terms would be used that are just less politicized. But then when you end up coming to a conference, a class, a workshop, they would actually talk about very sensitive things. I thought about the media and like the Yulunjiandu concept of supervision of public opinion, very official concept that's kind of means something like media criticism. But when you come to the actual conference, it's all about like investigative journalism, media ethics, censorship, like things that are really not to be talked about. So maybe that's something that's happening a bit in the US, where it's like, let's change the names, let's change like the big title about something that we care about. I hope that's at least like the substance will remain, but sometimes I worry about how fast the names are shifting, the titles, the behavior, right? How quickly people are responding with compliance.
Yeah. That it only goes so far. When you can't talk about the thing that you're talking about, then you're already living in some kind of situation where the fear of the state occupies a part of your mind and you're not free to pursue intellectual interests anymore.
I guess the counter argument to that from that individual might be that, well, we're just being pragmatic and, where does it end, right? Will the next step be to observe classrooms or to report somebody's not committing to the name, so to speak, the new name, they're actually subverting it? What would that look like then? So it is still worrisome.
It's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
How would you say the way that China controls the media differs from the way that Putin's government does it in Russia?
The differences are quite striking when it comes to levels of institutionalization. So as I mentioned, in China, there are major institutions in charge of media management, governance, like giving directives to editors. If you think about regional propaganda departments, the GAP that's in charge of licensing, the cyber administration that's in charge of digital content. We have all these different institutions in China that are very busy with observing what's being published, giving directives, even having meetings with editors and having all kinds of relationships with them and constantly monitoring and supervising them preemptively. When it comes to Russia, from what I've studied and observed, it was a lot more post facto, reactiveness. Like if something is increasingly deemed as dangerous, critical, subversive, then that editor would be potentially threatened. And oftentimes it was physical response, like physical assault and murder rate is very high, right? When it comes to Russian critical journalism space, like Novaya Gazeta, one of the top investigative outlets in Russia that's now operating outside of Russia, they have this whole wall of photographs of journalists who were murdered, who worked there. Like when I visited that outlet, that's the first thing they showed me. They said that's what they showed to the new intern or a new colleague coming in. It's like, this is the kind of risk you're taking. So the physical risk is much higher, and it's very unpredictable kind of coercion. In the case of China, there's more predictability in a way. Kind of, it sounds almost like there's a little more comfort in knowing that you'll get a lot of signals. You're not going to just be suddenly thrown off by something. You will know.
And then you'll lose your job. You won't be thrown out the window.
Yeah, you'll lose your job. Most likely you'll be displaced. If you work for a party outlet, you might be sent to work in some regional small publication.
Right.
The same thing with professors, right? If they're kind of too outspoken, they might be sent to like a remote school as opposed to being in Beijing or Shanghai, to kind of get demoted essentially. Whereas in Russia, the unpredictability, I think, is a lot higher, and there aren't as many institutions directly managing, media content on daily or kind of routine basis. There are certain similarities, like there are some rules when it comes to licensing that if you end up, being accused of, for instance, publicizing extremist content, and extremism is a very broad term, in Russian legislature, then after, I think, 2 warnings, they could get rid of your license. Then you can no longer operate in Russia. So those types of rules and regulations exist in the legal system. There are ways to discipline the media. And again, it's kind of post factum. Like once this is observed, then you get punished. You might not get too many signals in advance. And then also a lot of coercive economic control. So for example, like there would be tax police visiting a media outlet's kind of office space and saying you didn't pay your taxes on time or you paid insufficient amounts. So basically trying to coerce them to pay more, or sometimes telling them you can't stay in the space anymore. So as a result, they get too squeezed economically, they can't continue operating. Or the owner of the outlet, who's often a private individual, a rich, oligarch or something, he would be threatened, which is of course something that Putin started his whole attacks on the media with, is threatening individual rich media owners. So very personalistic in some ways, kind of control, more post-factum reactiveness than in China. But interestingly now, post-invasion of Ukraine, most of these outlets that I've studied in the past, they're pretty much gone out of Russia. They're all operating in Europe. TV Rain, Novaya Gazeta, a lot of individual journalists, Meduza, right, is another very famous outlet.
Meduza is in Latvia now, right?
In Latvia, yeah. All of these interesting people who took all these risks, I mean, not all, but many of them are no longer in Russia. And it was happening through this licensing kind of coercive act where it's like you no longer have a license to operate here because of what you published about the war. So this was the extremist legislation being applied directly on these outlets, which from my experience of researching this for many years, it was rarely used. But post-invasion, it actually was used, and then, they had no choice but to leave.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that seems like more of a model than China for what's going to happen here is the use of tax investigations. And it's in the case of broadcasters, broadcast licenses, I suppose. So how do critical journalists and media manage to function inside such systems? And obviously, you've just said that in Russia, a lot of them aren't inside the system anymore. They've just exiled themselves and are operating from abroad. I mean, there are still some critical voices in China, very few, and they're very soft and very difficult to hear. And I assume in Russia too. How do they continue to operate?
Well, they use different techniques. I haven't researched this in a little while, but from what I've studied before, I observed several techniques that in China, for instance, journalists deploy to survive in that environment. One of them is avoiding certain sensitive edges, right? Very specific sensitive topics that are currently kind of in the heat of the moment, and writing something more kind of aggregate, like a longer form piece that talks about the same issue, but from a bit of a distance or more analytically, as opposed to kind of spot on critique of a very specific hot topic. The other would be related to that is burying criticism, just not directly critiquing, but using metaphors or burying it in like the middle of the piece, the paper, the article, as opposed to, making it a title, or putting a certain kind of hopeful tune to the piece at the end or at the beginning, like, hey, things are being resolved, things are moving in the right direction. But in the middle of the piece, you actually discover all the things that went wrong and why. So the style, kind of the genre of actual writing is very different. It's kind of, solutions oriented, more hopeful, and yet it could still have a critical kind of underbelly. But one has to know how to find it. It's not like immediately obvious. You have to read the whole thing to notice what's actually critical about this piece. So it takes more, I guess, literacy in this kind of techniques to understand that it's meaningful, and people who know, they know, but otherwise others might miss it as well. And then I think a lot of it still is up to relationship building with, officials, local officials, people who will give you information. I think the same thing would be the case for the U.S. and certainly for Russia, where it depends on, how do you write a story? You still have to have relationships with these people to share information with you. So maintaining strong relationships, but that also means upholding certain self-censorship, I guess, because you don't want to offend individual people who might be feeders of information for you in the long term. So kind of balancing this idea of like having some good relationships, but also not being too subdued or, too self-censored. That's a very tricky balance that I think a lot of journalists are kind of dancing around as well. And then some of it, I think, is choosing to write very personal accounts that have nothing to do with politics, but then alluding to politics through like social issues, or just, going away from politics altogether and writing about issues that are maybe more about society or culture and that have kind of a political shadow attached to them, but not directly tackling politics. So in some ways, one can say that's withdrawal, but in other ways, it's kind of adaptation, creative survival, depends how we kind of treat it. One can kind of dismiss it as just being, this is nothing, it's just shrinking. And yet, I think these voices are still significant. They're still important.
They are, but it is a bit of a debate. I mean, I remember having a lot of discussions in China looking at publications like Caixin or Nanfang Zhongmo, the Southern Weekend newspaper, two publications that have always managed to engage in some level of critical journalism and talking about how, well, you have to read to the end of this 10,000 word article to actually discover the criticism. And the question being, well, is that even a thing then? If only the most highly educated people with enough time to read a 10,000 word article can actually understand that it's critical. It's like a tree falling in the forest with no one around it.
In Russia, the complaint from the critics of this kind of, critical or independent journalism was that, you're just appealing to your own people, basically, because the way you write, your genre is like that you're speaking to the same, kind of group of people. You're not really reaching the mass audience. And I think in China, I tended to think maybe there's a little bit more effort to reach to the wider public. And yet, because it's so buried, the critique, these types of subversive comments, they're so hard to kind of get to. One has to be a very persistent reader, to be able to understand and decipher that.
I mean, some might say that we're already here in the United States. I mean, I sometimes look at the front page, the homepage of the New York Times when, the most batshit crazy stuff is going on in Washington, D.C. And it kind of there's no screaming in the headlines. Everything is sort of sane-washed and sort of normalized in some odd way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wonder how much of that is a deliberate kind of self-regulation of sorts and how much of it is just like, we're an objective sort of, we're an objective news outlet, so we're just going to state the facts. We're not going to attach an emotional kind of affective component to
judgment. Yeah.
Because even in his first term, I remember there was a similar kind of complaint that it's like, well, the media is not taking it seriously enough, or they're just kind of reporting it as if it's normal. They're normalizing his candidacy, his leadership, his manner of governance. And I think the same kind of concern is showing up now again.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I mean, that there is an odd thing, I think, about American journalism, the sort of almost obsession with both sidesing everything. And I mean, the idea in the United States that journalists shouldn't vote, that is quite commonplace in the elite media, that, if you're a journalist, you shouldn't vote, which to me is a completely outrageous idea, to think that would make a difference to your coverage. Anyhow.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So, I mean, modern authoritarian regimes can maintain a facade of democratic processes while actually undermining them in practice. How does this performative governance manifest in media strategies across Russia, China, and then, perhaps what we can see from what's coming in the United States? Yeah,
the performative governance, democratic governance is certainly a big facet of especially competitive authoritarian regimes that they have elections. And I think one of the big facets is just the election itself is like, is it really competitive? Maybe that's the question that we're going to be asking here in the years to come. Like how competitive, how free and fair are the elections in the United States, given all the interference from Musk and other oligarchs? So that's something I think I would be watching for when it comes to performance versus reality. But for now, at least with local elections, it seems like there's real contestation. So I'm hopeful that perhaps elections will stay put, but I am concerned about that a lot. But when it comes to China and Russia, I mean, in Russia, of course, they have their elections. So they're known to be not fair, and there's no competition to Putin. The only competition was Navalny, who was allegedly murdered in jail, right? So there is no one really competing against him, and it's almost impossible to compete against him. But the election still persists, and there's so many ads and kind of propaganda initiatives to get people to vote, which I think is fascinating. I was showing it in my class recently, and students were like, well, why would they care about making people vote if it's only one party or only one leader? Like, why are they so obsessed with voting? Because they want to maintain the kind of performance function of elections, right? They want to make it look like there's some semblance of democracy. They don't want to appear as if there's just nothing there. It's just all purely authoritarian. Of course, Russia also calls itself a democracy, so does China.
China's a full process democracy.
It's full process. So there's a lot of responsiveness to everybody's concerns. If your light is broken on the street, the local government official will fix it.
Right.
You press a certain button, it's going to be great. So it's a different demonstration of democracy, democratic governance, different conception, but both countries define themselves as democratic in different forms. I think Russia very much, the election was at the heart of this. It continues to be the heart of this identity that's being kind of manufactured and sold to people. Media used to be a big part of it up until the war, the invasion of Ukraine. Prior to the invasion, as I mentioned, there were all these outlets and they were kind of allowed to exist. There were these islands. Maria Lipman, one of these very well-known scholars of Russian media, called it islands of press freedom. Just they're kind of on this periphery, but they're allowed to continue because they're not seen as a threat, and they make Russia look like a more democratic entity. There are all these voices directly criticizing Putin. So how is it not a democracy? But since the invasion, that has changed, which makes me also think about the paranoia and the kind of fear that kicks in when the crisis hits. That these outlets are no longer seen as islands; they're seen as potential threats, and they're just being squished out of the country. There was a big change, I think, a huge change for Russian media space. And in China, facade of democracy, well, it's a little bit tricky because, there's no election, so people are not electing Politburo leaders or the high, government officials. But yet the whole process democracy is definitely a thing that's being promoted, not only domestically, but internationally. It's like we have this process that allows for officials at all levels to hear people's concerns and to respond to them. Part of it may have some truth to it. I mean, there's certain things that are being responded to, but very selectively, right? So depends on your requests and the kinds of things you're complaining about. So if it's about fixing something that's practical, that may get a response. If it's about political process, it might not, right? So most likely. So it's very selective kind of responsiveness. It's a selective whole process democracy, but that's not how it's being presented. So there's kind of a facade of, that's a full concern and engagement with public opinion. Like people have a voice, they have a stake, they get to choose and shape policy. And in part, maybe they do, but only certain policies and only when it's practical and doable for the party officials to address it. So that's something that's, again, very selective, very guided. And, part of it then what we could say is a facade.
Right. I suppose Hong Kong is another interesting side of that because they have allowed the press to remain relatively free compared to the mainland in Hong Kong, especially the English language press. I mean, the South China Morning Post is still a fairly good newspaper and even includes some critical reporting on the Chinese government. I mean, the Chinese language press has essentially all been completely tamed in Hong Kong. But from the outside, it still looks like this information is flowing freely. It can still be a reliable place to do business and free flow of information.
There's still something out there, still something, flowing, and it's not completely controlled.
So how do citizens in China and Russia, how do they respond to government messaging and propaganda in these different environments? How much of Chinese and Russians do they absorb and start to agree with government talking points? And how much do people kind of hear the messages coming out of the government and just accept that that's the government messaging and don't necessarily respond to it? And, are Americans heading that way?
Yeah, I think this is like a pretty tough question because it kind of leads us to the question of how do we know what we know about what people think in these countries? How do they respond? What do they actually think about the policy? What do they think about the messaging? So a lot of it is done through public opinion surveys when it comes to studying people's sentiments. It's like, they're happy, unhappy with, whatever government policy, or they seem to be satisfied with Putin, unsatisfied. So the surveys give us a very superficial glance at it, but also in these societies, the surveys are also, they have their biases, right? Who knows how people are responding to questions about Putin? Are they really feeling comfortable to share if they're fully on board or not? Like, do they feel free to state what they think? And I wonder about that in the U.S. context too, like how much self-censorship is happening when it comes to responding to the surveys, whether or not and why you support, for instance, President Trump. Is it economic policy that drove you to this election choice, or is it something about personality and ideology and like things that are more ephemeral, right? Like this kind of affective connection to him, which sounds maybe like something one could be embarrassed about perhaps and not say that in the survey. So it makes it very hard to disentangle like why, if they're supporting the leader or the government, and why, but more broadly, even how do they think about it? Do they support? I think that's something that's going to be a struggle to measure here in some ways as well. Some of the responses are very contradictory from what I've seen in the public opinion surveys here in the US about Trump election, the most recent election. There are still some things we can kind of decipher in the cases of Russia and China, for instance, when it comes to patriotism and nationalism, this large kind of overarching sentiments of supporting your nation or standing up for your nation. We see a lot of that kind of discourse on social media when it comes to various crises, whether China, talking about Taiwan or Russia talking about Ukraine, a lot of kind of rallying around the flag effect of supporting the nationhood. And as a result, a leader. So these kind of moments of major, whether it's wars or other types of crises, seem to suggest that at least some degree of propaganda is working when it comes to aligning people behind these big events or big destructive strategies. In some ways, they're really not in self-interest of Russian public when it comes to fighting in Ukraine. And yet the discussions online are just heavily patriotic for the most part, except for those critical voices, and many of them are outside the country.
Right.
But then again, it's hard to tell how much of it is genuine support and excitement about this mission or about the Russian government in general, and how much of it is self-censorship again, right? If you were free to talk about it in whatever way you want, would you really say it in this way? And how do we know? So we don't have kind of a counter model or experiment here. We just have what we have, which is social media data, some surveys, and conversations with people if we get to go on the ground and talk to them.
One huge difference, I think, between the United States and Russia and China is that Russians and Chinese people, even quite young ones, many have the memory of, some kind of deprivation or poverty, and they've known far worse times than the present time. I think perhaps the very youngest Chinese for the first time now, have been experiencing some years of negative, where things don't seem so optimistic, but this is pretty new. I don't think the average American has really ever had a hard time. I see a lot of online discourse millennials complaining about how they came of age and the Great Recession. And then, every time things are just about going right, they get messed over by some new recession. But if I think of the years in America post 2008, compared to almost anywhere on the planet, the standard of living is so incredibly high. People actually have no idea how bad things can get. And that makes me wonder if, the next year we might see, I don't know how bad things will get. Clearly, the economy is going to take a hell of a hit from the tariffs. We're recording just a couple of days after Trump. It's April the 4th. It's 2 days after so-called Liberation Day. It's amazing how the vocabulary it reminds me of sort of authoritarian countries. It's freedom is slavery, right? So Liberation Day is the day when you tank the economy. How important is the cultivation of a strong leader persona, when thinking about Trump versus Xi Jinping or Putin or, hearkening back to earlier eras in Russia or China? Can you talk about the dear leader?
Yeah, I just wanted to step back a little bit to your earlier point about the kind of the softness maybe of the American public.
Yes, please.
When it comes to these upcoming shifts, I was thinking about that also with regards to maybe the complicity we're seeing, right, that we talked about earlier about self-censorship and just very fast kind of yielding to potential threats or risks or whatever it is, just kind of saying, yeah, I'll just change the name or change the course or adjust this or deport the student or whatever, all these different tactics. It makes me wonder how much of this has to do with being unprepared, right, for the moment, because there hasn't been this kind of experience here in recent history of having such a dramatic shock and shift in rules and just norms and everything we consider to be taken for granted, like freedom, or at least say whatever we want, suddenly is really under question. And people, institutions really aren't prepared to deal with it. They're like, okay, well, I guess just going to kind of react. It's all very reactive. And you wonder, didn't you think this might happen? He did say all kinds of things prior to the election. Why have there not been policies, or not policies, but some kind of agendas established by universities collectively on how to deal with this? But it seems like they haven't. It's just everybody's reacting in distinct but similar ways, but kind of ad hoc reactions. This makes me kind of wonder how much of it also has to do with some degree of this kind of softness, unpreparedness, lack of experience with these types of situations in recent memory. As I was talking to some Chinese colleagues teaching in the U.S., some were surprised that even Chinese universities push back harder, sometimes to various degrees of control, but they're used to it. It's this is the reality. You have to kind of negotiate, push back, find ways, organize. There's all kinds of things that you just have to be mindful of. But here it's it's a pretty sudden shock to the system. And the reaction so far is just kind of quick adaptation and not really, I guess, a thoughtful long-term response so far. Maybe that will change with time. But it reminded me of your comment on the economy as well. We don't know how people will respond to that if the recession is extremely harsh and it's going to really, really affect the well-being of people directly for a long time. What kind of response will this generate? Are people going to wake up and kind of come out in large numbers? Are they going to vote differently? What will this crisis kind of yield other than adaptation, right? So that made me wonder.
Because these things are new things in the United States, at least in the living memory, they're new.
Yeah, they're new. So then I think about Russia, where there's this mentality that, we've suffered as a nation, kind of in a prolonged manner for decades and maybe even centuries. And people are so resilient that they just get through any hardship,
Has Russia ever not suffered?
Exactly. We're just here to suffer on this planet. That's all we're here to do. So it's like, yes, the economy is down, but we can survive. We can still, find ways. And in China too, it's like the country has gone through so much that perhaps it's just a period one has to struggle through and suffer through and not quite give in to this feeling of doom or disillusionment with the system, even though I do think young people are becoming more disillusioned in China. But here, it's a pretty new reality. So I'm curious and I guess a little bit, in some ways, maybe a little bit optimistic that people might find themselves alert and maybe they'll wake up and act differently. On the other hand, I worry about also kind of just soft compliance, the way we're seeing it in the public sphere.
Yeah.
So far, the reaction of some of the leading universities and law firms doesn't inspire confidence in the backbone of the American people so far.
Yeah,
we shall see.
And it makes me think of also these theories on like authoritarian personality. They kind of went out of fashion for a while, but now some scholars are arguing that maybe it's something about adherence or regard for authority in certain cultural contexts that are more important than like the system itself. So maybe people actually want more authority, or they just kind of succumb to authority easier, in some groups versus others. And there have been some surveys of Trump supporters that indicate that. I mean, I'm a little bit cautious of such arguments because it kind of groups people into just big brackets, and it's quite a sweeping statement to say that a certain group is more, adhering to authority or likes authority or authoritarian personality, right?
Is that sort of the George Lakoff way of thinking about it, that Republicans want daddy?
Yeah, kind of daddy. And it comes back to your question about leaders cultivating a certain persona and the big leader image. What does this mean? How do leaders do it? And we certainly see a lot of this cultivation here in the United States, that even the language we just talked about, the Orwellian language, but also the persona itself. It's like this is the individual at the heart of the system that's to be admired, and that has a kind of almost godlike persona. I mean, I was just struck by everything that led to this election, with Trump being, suffering this assassination attempt and coming out from that even stronger, and this whole godlike kind of image, like I'm just this survivor and I'm carrying a larger mission. We see this also definitely in Russia, with Putin using gender norms as well, kind of this macho image of himself as this very resilient individual that can go through anything, that can suffer anything, and it's very strong, physically strong, mentally strong. He also goes to church, of course. He's spiritual, all those kind of qualities that make him this incredibly unique and admirable individual. And ironically, many women support him and actually find him very attractive or inspiring as like the male figure.
Right. Like Trump, really.
Yeah, like Trump. Of course, they have a certain affinity towards each other, right? From what we know, there's some kind of chemistry in the way that they connect. And then we have Xi Jinping, who doesn't use maybe as much of a gendered image of, I guess, a more like kind of sexual prowess, but more so maybe this, grandpa, soft leader / very organized, thoughtful, wise. They refer to him as uncle, right? Grandpa, all those different softer terms, but still someone who is to be definitely admired and who is almost unreachable, like someone who is kind of out there and just can be replicated. So I think maybe a little bit more similarity I see with Trump and Putin, right? But the cultivation of the image, the individual kind of as the representation of the system is the case in all three countries.
Yeah. What sometimes amazes me about Trump, though, is like Putin, he rides bareback on a horse without a shirt on. He drives through, snow on these kind of macho looking snowmobiles. He, fights with bears and goes fishing. And Trump like rides around in a golf cart.
Not exactly, indicating physical prowess.
Yeah.
But yet he can survive an assassination attempt, right? And he's up like an insane amount of hours doing this press conference. I mean, if you see him, we saw him right after the election, right? He was signing all those executive orders at like 8, 9 p.m., 10 p.m. Like this man just never sleeps.
Incredible. I mean, and for all the like conventional wisdom about, staying healthy, I mean, he doesn't appear to do any proper exercise. He seems to eat hamburgers all day long and unstoppable. It's very frustrating.
It gives him even more like a sort of mystique, right? Especially for people who see him as an inspiration. It's like this man is like not following any norms. He's different. He's coming from the business sector. He's not really a politician, and he eats whatever he wants. He doesn't sleep. Like he doesn't care about, social norms. He can offend somebody and say whatever he wants. He can get shot at and he still survives. It's something about kind of just like going against the grain entirely, which I think for many people, his supporters is very exciting. And so it again gives him some kind of this aura of invincibility, but also is relatable. It's like somebody who's eating like, similar diet as him, who doesn't care about all those health codes and norms and being civil. It's like, oh yeah, I'm like him. Like I can relate to that as well. In some ways, there's flexibility than, say, with Putin, who cultivates such a strong body image as well, that it's like, who's going to relate to that? Like, there are very few people who are going to be fighting bears and riding those machines or whatever. This is a kind of like, it's like only he can do that, right?
Right. It's a different kind of appeal.
Very different appeal. Yeah.
So what are the signs we should look for here in the United States that will indicate like a deepening of authoritarian media control?
Yeah, I mean, I think some signs that we should look for, they're very subtle. So, for example, like we're already seeing signs of Trump administration prioritizing some voices over others when it comes to access, like who gets to access information.
Like putting the right-wing podcasters and bloggers in the White House press room.
Yeah, putting those bloggers there in White House and then kicking out like AP because they used the wrong name or whatever title that doesn't agree with the administration. It's like, basically punishing through these acts of information access, like lack of access or giving access, restricting access or granting access. I think those are really interesting because they remind me also a lot of a Chinese approach where I didn't mention it earlier, but the access is a huge thing. It's like, yes, one thing is giving directives, but the other is like, can you even get information? And so much of what journalists complain about, I think across every, country where they work in is access. Like, I can't talk to this official. I don't know how to get the information, or I've been barred from some kind of an event. So access is like so critical. And I think we're seeing this here playing out with these types of acts where it's like, well, let me just not allow for this outlet to be here anymore, or invite those other voices. And it's interesting how quickly there was, I don't know if it was legitimized, but even in my class, some students were like, well, yeah, we need more balanced perspective. So it's like, you just got some voices from the other side to be part of the pool, the press pool, right? But they're not legitimate outlets, like, right? Some of them are just their blogs. They're not like professionalized news outlets. And yet now they're being legitimized as such. So that's also kind of softly including certain voices that are usually the outcasts are now becoming the mainstream, which I think is also quite interesting. And people don't pay attention. They're like, okay, they're just like different perspectives, but are they actual news outlets or not? How do we treat that question? So those signs I would be, looking out for the subtleties of access, but also punishment that are harsher, like in coercive ways. We're seeing punishments now against students who have been active or activists on certain sensitive issues, whether it's about Palestine, Israel, but also now new rules, right, about checking social media accounts as you enter the country on a student visa and so forth. So I wonder how much, this can also transcend into the journalism space, especially if you're a journalist that's not a U.S. citizen, but even if you are, checking and punishing for certain perspectives or certain kind of views in a more coercive manner. Like, oh, you no longer can stay in the country. You're not a citizen, so, you're out. So punishing by like completely ridding of this individual on the soil of the United States, just like sending them back or, not giving them access to the visa itself. Yeah. I mean, the thing that I'm concerned about is the slippery slope of these coercive acts against students, intellectuals, postdocs, also spreading to the media sphere. Like once we see a journalist who's not a U.S. citizen treated the same way, like that would be like, okay, this is really spreading into that space. But then other things like more economic, cooptation or coercion that we've talked about earlier, where it's more about broadcasting licenses but also just like taxing or, lawsuits against certain outlets based on economic regulations. Where is that going to take us? Like, is this going to be the new normal or kind of the Russia style, like very mafia-like, attacks on the media through economic coercive acts or policies or restrictions? That's another thing I would watch for in this environment.
So your research about China, about Russia, Soviet Union, other countries that you've studied, is there a parallel to Elon Musk that you found? You can't look at Russian oligarchs and say this is the same thing because it's not. Where would you suggest we turn if we want to look for like some kind of rhyme?
It's challenging. I guess I can't think of a single character, individual that would match Musk exactly because he's supposed to be the richest man on earth, right? His wealth just exceeds any possibility, like imagination of a single country. Like he's a global phenomena. Something about him that because he's global, he's involved in all this transnational right-wing political movements as well. Like you see him supporting politicians, figures, movements in Germany, other parts of Europe. Like he's speaking out and fundraising issues that are way outside of the US. I think that makes him really unique, kind of a very new, entity or a very troubling phenomena, whatever we call it. But it's different from the other, like the rich figures or oligarchs, whether it's in China or Russia. They were kind of more nationally bound. And as a result, also more containable by the politicians in charge. Even in China, there's always friction between Xi Jinping and like the rich, right? The kind of the big entrepreneurs, the big, like we think about Alibaba, for instance, company, like, these different rising stars. Somehow there's always tension between them and the regime.
And when they get too big for their boots, like Jack Ma making statements about the financial regulators, his wings were clipped.
Yes, they're clipped. So, I mean, that's something maybe we can look at this. When do we start seeing tension between Musk and Trump? And is Trump and his administration, are they really able to actually clip his wings? because he is this kind of transnational figure. He can go elsewhere. He can attack from multiple angles. He has such incredible resources. Is he like clippable, right? In the way that Jack Ma was, or that Khodorkovsky was in Russia, and, other oligarchs in the Russian context. It seemed like the tension eventually arises. And there were some reports that Musk and Trump are not always on the same page. So I do wonder, when are we going to see this kind of the clash? And if the clash happens, or when it happens, what will the response be? Is he going to be containable or not? What would this kind of clash look like in this context? So we can, I guess, anticipate the tension eventually coming to the surface and watch for those signs of regulation coming from the leadership towards the oligarch, or in this case, just the wealthiest man on earth, right?
Yeah. I mean, maybe we actually have to look to science fiction for parallels, Blade Runner or,
Yeah. I mean, it's really just kind of unfathomable just how distinct this is, Musk's actions and his involvement and his passion and kind of this commitment to certain causes, big political causes and movements are just around the world. I mean, he's beyond the United States. That's really fascinating. And again, changing so quickly. It's the pace of it is so rapid that it's hard for everyone to keep up.
Yeah, fascinating and frightening.
Very frightening, yeah.
On that grim note, thank you so much, Maria Repnikova. What a pleasure to chat to you about these things. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Jeremy Goldkorn, and edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by U.S.A. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review. And if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com. Maria Repnikova, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It was a pleasure speaking to you.